Hey everybody, Dia Davidson here with another conversation on race. This time we're talking about music, specifically Black influences on America's music. Joining me now to talk about this and to have this conversation, Dr. Everett McCorvey. He's the director of UK's Opera Society. Dr. McCorvey, thank you so much for sharing time.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This is a subject that's close to my heart.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. Close to your heart and through your vocals too,
yeah,
and displays there. For how many years have you been at UK now?
This is my 29th year.
Wow.
Yeah, I came in 1991, and so it's been. I mean, I've lived here longer than I've lived anywhere, so this is home, and so I've certainly loved being here, and it's been a great marriage, I think, between the things that I do and the community and the University of Kentucky. So it's been great.
Well, I'll tell you, when I first got here, I'll never forget the spiritual ensemble program
Yes,
that you
yes, yes,
invited me to.
yes.
And that takes me back. So when I'm thinking of music,
Uh-huh.
and when we're exposed to music, especially when we're young,
Hmm.
we first learn our taste of music from our family, our parents, but we don't necessarily learn the history.
Hmm.
So let's talk a little bit about it. We love the genres. We hear the spirituals, the gospel in
Hmm.
church, and in the Black church we know
Hmm.
the roots,
Yeah.
but not everybody knows the roots.
Yes. Well, one of the reasons that I started the American Spiritual Ensemble was because of my experience as a child growing up in Montgomery, Alabama, where I was able to hear spiritual sung by groups like the Tuskegee Institute singers and Hampton University singers. And it really touched me. These choirs were coming through Montgomery in support of the civil rights movement. And so I would hear them in my father's church, which was First Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, where Reverend Ralph David Abernathy was the minister. And so it touched me greatly. So when I became a professional in music, I saw that the spirituals were not being performed as much anymore, and I wanted to have influence over that to try to encourage the spirituals to be sung and performed because they were such an important part of our history. And I'm delighted today with how the spirituals are now performed all over, not only in churches, but in concert halls, at universities. Our students are learning spirituals. They are revered all over the world. And our audience may be interested in knowing how important the spiritual was to establishing American music in this country. I mean, if you think about the fact that we've just passed the 400th anniversary of the slaves coming over to being brought over to this country. It was 1619 when the first group of enslaved people arrived on this land, and they created a music that I call the mother music, and I call the spirituals the musical foundation for all of American music. And that's a pretty bold statement, I guess. But before the slaves came, if you think about this, English, the British music was what was here, and music brought to this country was music from the colonials' homeland. And so America did not have its own voice. And then, of course, the spirituals came into being. And then throughout the history of American music, the influence of the spiritual has been phenomenal. And so as a result of the spirituals, American music was formed in a manner that integrated what had been started with spirituals into everyday music. I mean, I think of one of the things invented, I guess if you call it, or created in American music was call and response. And the call and response came right out of the spirituals and in the plantation fields, where as they were working in the fields, one person would start a song or sing the first part of the song, and the rest of the workers would respond to that. And that call and response technique has continued to, one of the examples I use in my concerts is, Gladys Knight and
The Pips.
the Pips. That's right. Diana Ross and
The Supremes.
the Supremes. I mean, it just goes on. And that's what Motown used. They used the call and response, where they had a lead singer and then the backup singers. That's right out of the cotton fields of spirituals. And so a technique like the call and response, which was created in spirituals, has now, taken over American music. And so in every part of American music, from Motown to the Lion King, you have call and response. And so that's been the influence of American music.
But it's even more than just the vocals. It's the instruments as well.
Well, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the fact that the slaves were not allowed to bring their own instrument, they were not allowed to speak their languages when they came. They were separated from their families. But if you think about the instruments that were African instruments, that they were able to bring the concept and the technique over, the drums, the banjo. The instruments that, became part of that American folk music sound were instruments that the slaves created based on instruments that they had in their country.
And passed it down through generations.
That's
and
right.
Then we talk about movement when we think about the different dance styles.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Again,
The enslaved were, in their own time, which was not a lot of time, but in their own time, they danced, they sang, they did this. There was this custom called the ring shout, where they would sing a song, and while they were singing the song, they would dance in a circle. And so this ring shout led to other forms of dances. And if you look at especially American ballet theater, the Martha Graham technique, dance theater of Harlem, there are so many Alvin Ailey dancers now who have taken these movements and made them now into an American form of movement that is recognized throughout the world. As we recognize ballet, American music, American dance is recognized all over the world in the same way.
And an African-American young lady is the prima ballerina now.
That's right, for the New York City Ballet.
New York City, yes.
That's right.
So we're everywhere. We are.
Yeah, we are. I don't know if you
everywhere.
saw, have you seen that recent, there's a recent YouTube, or is it YouTube or Facebook post of this young man from, I think he's from Kenya or somewhere, where he's dancing.
Yes.
And now the American Ballet Theater has offered him a scholarship.
Yes.
Which I think is just fantastic. It just warmed my heart when I saw that.
And it's just pure. I mean, his movements are so graceful, even despite the conditions around him, the dirt on the ground.
Right.
He's beautiful the way he glides.
Yeah. And so I thought that was really, really wonderful. And again, it just shows how what we do and what has been how we influence the world in terms of what we're able to do. Of course, it didn't as we got through slavery and we started going, you remember I talked about the fact that we call music, the spirituals, the mother music. And the reason I say that is because it influenced blues, it influenced jazz, pop music, Broadway, R&B. It influenced the whole genre of American music. And If you have the spirituals that go up to, you know, certainly up to emancipation, the Emancipation Proclamation. And then, of course, you have the advent of, a lot of people don't know the influence of Antonin Dvorak, who was a classical composer from Czechoslovakia who came to this country in the late 1800s. And he was part of the influence of writing these spirituals down so that then they could be performed by generations after him. And then, of course, you think of the early 1900s, it was just an explosion, you know, of music, as these musicians that were now able to attend school and learn the rudiments of music, you know, under teachers like Dvorak, then became part of the working community of musicians in this country. And so you had blues that started in the early, you know, 1900s, and people who influenced the blues. You had the minstrel shows, you had the barbershop quartets that the black quartets that sang all over the country, also in the early 1900s. And then you had the introduction of jazz, and all of this was an influence of, again, that mother music of the spirituals. And so it was like, and jazz, of course, was probably the first music that took the world by storm. You know, in France, in Germany, in all parts of the world, people were being introduced to jazz, and it was just a hot item. And so I think that there are just so many ways that the spirituals introduced, influenced all of the other genres of music.
And of course, the church has always been sort of the heart and the center of the Black community. And we talk about, you know, the spirituals and especially in the fields of music, but that was really a communication style too.
Absolutely.
To help, it wasn't a sign of joy. We're not trying to say that at all. It was a communication. It was a safety. It was a let you know this is what's going to happen later, without anybody really knowing what was going on.
Well, you think of the Underground Railroad that was going on during slavery, and the very sophisticated system to help slaves to run to freedom. A lot of the instructions for the Underground Railroad were through the spirituals. They would sing songs that would give directions, and these directions then would tell the slaves where to go, where to turn. A lot of it was following the North Star. There was a spiritual called Follow the Drinking Gourd that gave a lot of instructions. You know, a famous spiritual like Steal Away to Jesus, you know, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. These were songs of instruction that told the slaves what to do, or communicated to the slaves what was going to happen, or when the Underground Railroad was going to be in the area. All of these things were sung through the spirituals. And of course, the slave masters allowed the slaves to sing, because what the slave master realized is that when the slaves sang, they produced more work. And so little did the slave master know that these songs were songs of instruction, or songs really guiding the slaves and telling them what was going to be going on.
And we talk about jazz, but once upon a time, people thought jazz was the devil's music.
Oh yeah, of course, yeah. You know, yeah. They you know, the ministers. Well, and it was the same with gospel music too. I mean, jazz, gospel music. You know, they thought it was the devil's music.
Oh.
You know, they didn't like it. I tell a funny story about the jazz musicians, as they began to, I'll call it, infiltrate the churches. And, you know, they would play in the blues clubs and the jazz clubs on Saturday night, and then go into the church on Sunday morning.
Right.
And the ministers started hiring these musicians to play on Sunday morning after, you know, and they'd been playing that night before in the clubs. And then you get a song like "Nearer My God to Thee," and then all of a sudden the jazz musician puts a little blue note in there. And it peps it up a little bit,
right?
And the ministers realized that very quickly that what they noticed was that when the gospel music was being played in the churches, that more young people were beginning to go to church. And so while the old guard, you know, would say, okay, this is the devil's music, you know, the ministers were looking at this and say, wait, young people are coming to church. Young people are responding to this music. And so it really sort of took off in the churches. But one thing I think a lot of people don't know is that really gospel music didn't come onto the scene until like the 1930s. And, you know, I think a lot of times people confuse gospel and spirituals, and they think that gospel has been here since, you know, 400 years, but really the spirituals were the mother music. And then of course, jazz and blues took on, and then gospel came on in the 1930s. And you think about the, also what happened around that same period of time was the development of records, you know, the Victoria records. Also, radio was beginning to be, you know, experimented with, but it was the records that really took this music around the world. And you had people like Thomas Dorsey, who was considered he's considered the father of gospel music. And, you know, one of the things that he wrote that was so popular was "Precious Lord, Take My Hand."
Wasn't Mahalia Jackson
Mahalia Jackson.
Yes,
so you think of these three things happening: the invention of the records, where people could now play their LPs and the little records, and Thomas Dorsey writing "Precious Lord," and Mahalia Jackson coming on the scene and singing "Precious Lord," and taking that all around the world. And so it's very similar. Something happened like that in opera with the famous tenor Caruso, you know, Enrico Caruso, who everybody says is the most famous tenor in the whole world. Well, the reason he is because of the same situation. He was the first recorded tenor. And so his records went around the world. And so he became famous the same way. But Mahalia Jackson took gospel music and really took that concept and that way of singing a hymn and singing songs around the world. And, you know, of course, gospel music now is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And, but she was crucial in doing something like that. And then, of course, you go into the 1950s, and you have artists coming on the scene like Chuck Berry, who was, of course, you know, rock and roll, and how important that was to what was happening. You had during the 30s, you had the Great Migration to the North, where a lot of Black families moved from the South and went to the North. And so you had cities like Chicago and Detroit that just had an explosion of African-American culture in their cities. And so those were hotspots for blues and jazz. But what was going on in the South, which was quite interesting, is that you had white artists beginning to discover Black music. And so you had Chuck Berry, of course, in the 1950s doing, you know, his, you know, rock and roll and all of that. you know, and but then you had other white singers who were going into these clubs
Elvis
listening to this
Presley.
music,
Mhm.
Elvis Presley, for example. And then what was happening is the Black artists didn't have the means or the access to be able to record a lot of this music and introduce it to a wider audience, whereas a lot of the white artists did. And so, you know, the white artists would take this music that they had heard a lot of times in these Black clubs and popularize it, and then get it out into the you know, the community and to the world. And that's how, you know, that's how people like Elvis Presley became so famous and started, because of course, you know, and that's, you know, that's just the way it was. I mean, it's,
Even
yeah,
repackaging songs. If they heard songs, then
yeah.
they would re-sing them or
That's
repackage
right.
them as
That's
their
right.
own.
That's
Right.
right. And so, so you had Black groups and white groups singing basically the same types of songs,
Mhm.
and so, but they were, you know, they were very popular. And then if we come on a little further, you had the introduction of the Beatles to, you know, the world in the '60s, and that was its own explosion. But what were they doing? They were mimicking, recreating the songs that they had heard in America that had been that were that American style, but they took it to Britain. They started it in Britain, and of course became huge fans in Britain before they came to the United States and started singing their songs. But it was similar to what had been happening in America already, but they just didn't have the opportunity to popularize it like the Beatles did. And so, but it really established all of these things happening, especially in the 1900s, between the beginning of the century and in the 1960s, really helped to establish American music as the desired music of the world. And so now what's happening is countries and bands all over the world wanting to, I guess, mimic and try to create the same types of things that were happening in America. And if you go on to the 1980s, then you have hip hop happening and the introduction of hip hop in what is hip hop? I mean, if you think of, you know, I've always thought of hip hop as the outlet of people in the Black community who actually wanted to recite poetry. And what did they do? They set poetry to music, and it was poetry to their music, and poetry that highlighted their experience. And then what's happening now with this music is it's all over the world. And what's the most popular show, Broadway show in the world right now is Hamilton. And what is Hamilton? It's rap and hip hop, you know?
Yes. Yes. And it's phenomenal.
It's
And it has
phenomenal.
captured all, I mean, my 10-year-old daughter loves not only the soundtrack, but watching it over and over and over again,
Yes.
thankfully, because it's on Disney Plus.
That's right. Well, my son, you know, when it came on Disney Plus, my son was happened to have been here, and you know, watching it, and I was just amazed at how he knew every word. And I was
Yes.
thinking, how did he learn all those words? Because there are a lot of words in Hamilton, you
And
know?
can sing it and know the movements and
Yeah, yeah. And so, but again, that's that influence
yes.
of the Black experience that has now made its way into the mainstream of American music. And as this was going on in the popular world, it was a similar thing was going on in the classical world as well, because of course you had classical artists like Roland Hayes, um, who was not able to, although he became a very famous tenor, was not able to sing opera in the main, halls. Marian Anderson, who was not able to sing in the main halls in this country until, she was very advanced in age. And
Paul
and
Robeson.
so, excuse me?
Paul Robeson.
Paul Robeson, the same way. Paul Robeson was a political activist. And, for a while, especially during the McCarthy era, he was blackballed for his political beliefs. But he, all of these, Marian Anderson, Paul Robeson, they made their famous careers in Europe and other parts of the world. They just were not accepted here. And Marian Anderson was the first African-American to sing at the Metropolitan Opera. And, and George Shirley was the first African-American tenor to sing at the Metropolitan Opera. And a lot of people probably don't know that Bobby McFerrin, the pop artist, his father was an opera singer. And
really?
Yes. And his father, Robert McFerrin, was the first African-American baritone to sing at the Metropolitan Opera. And so, I mean, it's, so it's, and of course, George Shirley, the first African-American tenor, is still alive. And so, and Robert McFerrin has passed on, and Marian Anderson has as well. But I mean, it's just been amazing that these things are happening in the classical world as well. And then, of course, now opera singers throughout the country are being recognized a lot more, as we recognize not only artists, but people of color throughout the country, as America is now sort of reconciling itself with the systematic racism that has continued to happen in our country. And so now America is looking more inward to say, okay, how can we identify the systematic racism that, Blacks have been talking about for years. And now, white America is starting to look at that and say, wait a minute, obviously this is still happening. Our country is still hurting. How can we address some of this systematic racism? So it's happening in the music world as well. I think the music world has been certainly influenced by the enslaved coming to this country, and all parts of the American musical genre, the American musical sound has been influenced by that on the popular side and the classical music side.
Because it's so important to remember, for everyone to remember, that slavery is not Black history. It interrupted Black history. Black history existed before.
Oh, absolutely.
And it just kind of had a hiccup there.
Absolutely.
And continues forward.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's an important thing to remember. And while the slavery was a dark time in American history, really the gift to America has been, one of the ways has been through the music, and the music that the enslaved were able to bring to this country and then influence the country really since they arrived here. And I think that influence will continue to go, because the music is so rich and so powerful, and American music throughout the country, throughout the world now, is regarded as a style of music that other countries want to emulate on the pop side, on the classical side. And I'm curious to see what's going to happen in the next generation as electronic music takes over, music that's being created over the internet. I mean, we're just starting.
Yeah. It's amazing. It's amazing. Dr. McCorvey, thank you so very much for sharing your wisdom and your thoughts and your history and your just your talents with us here in this community. And I thank everybody for joining us for this little conversation that we're having on music and, of course, race here in America. To hear all of the different conversations that we've had, please log on to lex18.com, our Facebook page, and all of our social media platforms. Until next time, I'm Dia Davidson.